Hey you guys. So tonight we're going to be talking about multiplying integers. Now, multiplying integers is a pretty straightforward concept. There's just a couple of rules that we have to follow. So the first thing I want to remind you is that an integer is a whole number that's either positive or negative. So one of the first things what we're going to look at is when we're multiplying integers that have the same sign. So we're talking about either a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative. And the rule about two integers that have the same sign is that the product of this is always going to be positive. Always, always, always. So two positives, a positive times a positive is going to equal positive, a negative times a negative is going to equal a negative. Okay? So for examples, we might see something that looks like here, positive 6 times positive 6 equals a positive 36. A negative 6 times a negative 6 is a positive 36. If we have, negative 5 times negative 5, we get a positive 25. If we have a negative 4 squared times a negative 2, we get a positive 32. Now, here's the deal about this. This 4 squared and this negative, because the negative is on the outside of the parentheses, that means that this is really technically like a negative 1 times 4 squared. And negative 1 times 4 squared is negative 1 times 16. And then we're going to multiply that times our negative 2. So that's where we're getting the negative times the negative there equaling the positive, because negative 1 times 16 is really negative 16. And then when we multiply negative 16 times a negative 2, that's where we get our positive 32 from, okay? This negative on the outside of the parentheses is a really big deal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, let's look at integers with different signs. So when we look at multiplying integers that have different signs, so a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative, the answer is always going to be negative. Always, 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 okay? So that's really important to know. A couple examples that we're going to want to look at here. Let's say I have 3 times a negative 4. Now, one of the important things that I want you to notice here is that in this problem, there isn't a multiplication sign. You don't see anywhere where it says 3 times negative 4, okay? But the important thing to know is that right here, in between the 3 and the parentheses signs, that means multiplication. So whenever you don't see an operation sign in between a number, it's in yellow, in between a number and a parentheses, it really means multiplication. It's like an invisible multiplication. So you have 3 times a negative 4 equals negative 12. Negative 7 times a positive 5 is a negative 35. Negative 2 times positive 3 is a negative 6. And here what we have is we have a negative. This is kind of like that one that we looked at up here, okay, where the negative is on the outside. Now, these two lines here, remember, represent absolute value. And the absolute value of 12 is 12. But this negative is on the outside here. So what we want to make sure that we identify here and that we recognize is the fact that because this negative is on the outside, this is actually a negative 12 times a positive 4. Okay, and once again, because the negative is on the outside, this means negative absolute value of 12. And the absolute value of 12 is 12. So we get negative 12 times a positive 4, and that's where we get our negative times our positive to give us the negative 48. Okay. This little chart here is kind of a nice little chart to help you remember. And one of the ways that I like to kind of remember is if you think about good and bad people and good and bad actions and good and bad consequences, okay? So one of the ways that you can help remember this is a positive times a positive equals a positive. So when a good thing happens to a good person, that is a good outcome. A negative times a negative is a positive. When a bad thing happens to a bad person, that's a positive outcome. Okay. When a good thing happens to a bad person, that's a negative thing. Positive times a negative is a negative. When a bad thing happens to a good person, that's also a bad thing. We don't like that. So that's going to be also a negative. Okay. So this little chart here, like I said, will kind of help you remember how and what to multiply. So same sign, positive. Same sign, positive. Different signs, negative. Different signs, negative. Okay. All right. A couple other examples that I want to look at here are when you have to use exponents. So this kind of, I want to introduce you to the idea of what I was talking about before. A positive sign inside the parentheses is very, very different than a negative, a negative sign inside parentheses is very different than a negative sign outside of parentheses or an absolute value symbol. So for example, this negative sign here is on the inside of this set of parentheses, okay? Which means that the negative 5 is going to be squared. So then this is actually going to end up being negative 5 times negative 5. Now we have a negative times a negative, and that gives us a positive 25. Here, we have our negative on the outside of the parentheses, out here. Okay, and remember, this really means negative 1. So now we're actually looking at negative 1 times 5 times 5, because 5 squared is 5 times 5. So negative 1 times positive 25 is a negative 25. Okay, here we don't have any parentheses. And so what do? Well, once again, you assume that this negative sign is part of the problem. It's not identified with this 5 at all. So once again, we're looking at a negative, all right, all by itself, and then we multiply that times 5 squared, which is 5 times 5. So we get 25 here, the negative is there, which means that it has to go with the problem at the end to get negative 25. Okay. A couple more examples you might see here are the same thing. This is this negative 3 here is kind of like this one that we looked at up here, this first one, right? Because the negative is inside the parentheses, which means that this is negative 3 squared. So we have negative 3 times negative 3. And when you have a negative times a negative, you get a positive 9. Here, we have a negative, but we don't have any parentheses. So this negative sign goes with the problem, not with the 7. This problem says a negative times 7 squared. And 7 squared is 7 times 7. So 7 times 7 is 49, and then you have to add the negative at the end. Same thing with the 6. This negative is out in the front. And so this is 6 times 6 times 6. And the negative is out in the front, which means that you can multiply all these positive 6 by each other to get 216. But because that negative is not inside the parentheses, you have to put it on at the end. Okay, now you might get a couple examples where you have multiple terms, okay? So here's our first guy kind of like that. Let's look at, I have negative 7 times a negative 5 times a negative 4. I have 3 negatives that are being multiplied together, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to multiply the first two. So I'm going to do negative 7 times negative 5, and that's going to give me a positive 35. Then I need to multiply that times a negative 4, and have a positive times a negative, which gives me negative 140. Let's go down to this 11 times negative 4. Let's see if I can move this guy up here and pull this guy down a little bit. Well, let's get this out here. There we go. All right. So 11 times negative 4 squared. Now, this negative 4 is inside the parentheses, which means this is negative 4 times negative 4. So when I move this, whoa, that was a weird noise. Sorry, guys. So when I move this, what I'm going to end up seeing is that I'm going to bring down my 11. -4 times -4 is a positive 16. And then 11 times 16, both positive, so this stays positive. This is 176. Okay, let's go over here. I'm going to do the same thing, just do 2 at a time. 12 times -2 is -24. And then I have to multiply that by this -4 squared. Well, there's no parentheses here, which means that this is 4 times 4, which is here, and then the negative is out in the front. 4 times 4 is 16. So this is going to end up being -24 times -16. Remember, 4 times 4 is the positive. You have the negative out in front. -24 times -16 is going to give you a positive 384. Okay. So that's what we are going to be looking at today for homework. Tomorrow we will be looking at division, but tonight you're doing multiplication. All right. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye.